Shalom Aleichem. Bracha u'shalom l'chulathem. Welcome to all. I wish to say a few words with regards to Mori, Moreno, Harav Gadol, Rav Moshe Tzuriel Zecher Sadiq Livracha, who passed away a few days ago. Rav Zuriel was born in the United States, I believe in New York City, not under the name Zuriel. His original family name was Weiss. I do not recall exactly how or when I met Mori Rav Zuriel Zitzal for the first time, but it was many years ago. It must have been at least 35 or even closer to perhaps 40, but not quite 40 years ago. Many years ago, Rav Zuriel used to come to Yerushalayim. He lived in Bnei Brak. He used to come to Yerushalayim once a week, and during that day in Yerushalayim, he would learn with a number of different people. For a number of years, the place where he actually set up shop, so to speak, in Yerushalayim, to meet with people and to learn with them during that day, during that one day per week, was my Beth Midrash at that time in Rehov Najara in Givat Shaul in Yerushalayim. So we would learn together. I would learn with Rav Tzuriel. We generally learn together Kidvei Rav Kook, the writings of Rav Kook Zitzal. And then some other people will also show up there to study with him. At other times, it was not in my Bet Midrash; it was in other venues. Harav Tzuriel Zitzal first came to Eretz Yisrael. Sorry, he first came to Eretz Yisrael in 1960, Leminyanam, Tau Shin Kaf. He studied for about a year or a year and a half at that time in Makaz Harav, which in those days was in Rehov Rav Kook in downtown Yerushalayim. And I can tell you one anecdotal story in connection to my relationship and association with Mori Rav Tzuriel Zitzal. When he studied in the yeshiva at that time, in Tafshin Kaf, he found in the Geniza, in the Shemus, in the place where, pages from books, Sidurim, Gemarot, other books that had become very heavily used and fallen apart, were placed before being taken somewhere to be buried. And he found there entire copies of the unbound printed pages of the original edition of Arpilei Tohar. Arpilei Tohar is the second of the Shemona Kevatzim, the 8 books or notebooks of writings that Rav Kook handed over to Rav David Nazir, Rav David Kohen Zitzal, whom I was zoche to see and meet on one occasion when I was 11 years old, at which time he put his hands on my head and gave me a beracha. This was in his home. It was on Purim, I recall. And Rav Kook handed the Nazir 8 kevatzim of Kidvei Yad. This is an edition, what I'm holding here, that you should be able to see. This is an edition that Moreno Harav Moshe Tzuriel Zitzal published just a couple of years ago of the Shemona Kibbutzim. The second of those 8 notebooks of manuscript is known as Arpilei Tohar, because that manuscript was sent to be printed by Rav Kook himself in Yerushalayim in those days, in the 1920s. The Minyanam, despite the fact that there are quite a number of radical and perhaps unexpected statements in those writings. But Rav Kook was obviously of the opinion that these writings of his, that he had written actually many years before, at least 15 years before, something like that, they should be printed, and he wanted it to be printed, and he sent it to be printed. His son, Harav Tzuriel Kook Zetzal, was of a different view. He felt that due to certain fairly groundbreaking and somewhat even radical statements in that particular volume, which was given the name Arpilei Tohar, due to some of the material there would be people who would roundly criticize Rav Kook. And he cajoled his father not to publish it, and to, in fact, end the printing of the book midstream, which is in fact what happened. Rav Tzuriel went to the printing press, I think it was on Rehov Strauss in Yerushalayim, and with his own hand switched off the electricity to end the printing. So that volume, known as Arpilei Tohar, was not completed and was never bound, and it was not disseminated. Moriya Rav Tzuriel Zitzal found a copy of those pages, of the whole book, that had, as much as had been printed, as much as they had managed to print until Rav Tzuriel came and switched off the printing presses. He found it in the Genizah, and he asked Rav Tzuriel directly whether he could take it, and Rav Tzuriel said to him, "Yes, you can take it." So he did, and he found 2 copies, and he took both copies were in his possession. And on one occasion, when I was learning with Rav Zuriel Zitzal, he brought with him one of those copies, and he handed it to me as a gift, and I have it in my possession to this day. The pages are yellowed and very brittle, and often the parts of the page fall off, crumble. But the pages are there, and they're legible, and you can see the original version also of the text. I say original because the history of that particular volume is as follows. It remained unknown and undisseminated for tens of years. When Harav Tzuriel Kook Zetzal was niftar, when he passed away in Tolshin Membeth in 1982, Leminyanam, this was on Purim, Tolshin Membeth. 1 year later exactly, in the Beit Midrash of Merkaz HaRab, where I was studying at the time, there was an askara, and Harav Yitzchak Shilat had received permission from whoever it was who could give that permission. It's not actually very clear who can or should be able to give permission, which is something I wish to elaborate upon in a moment. He was given permission to publish that volume in its entirety, which he did. But he, in 6 places in that volume, he changed the original wording and text of Rav Kook. He did, it should be stated, to his credit, Rav Shilat did state in front of the entire assembled crowd that he changed the text in 6 places, and he actually pointed out where those 6 places were. So people like myself quickly wrote these things down, and when the book was published on that day, and I bought it, I immediately penciled in the original reading. Today we don't need to do this because since that time, all of those Shmona Kivatzim, all those 8 notebooks of writings of Rav Kook, which comes to, I'm not sure exactly, but a couple of thousand pages, I think. All of those volumes were printed according to the original manuscript. And that goes back originally about 30 odd years. This version here in 2 volumes like this, printed by Moshe Rav Kook and given the same outward appearance as many of the other Sfarim of Rav Kook. In this version here, we also have the original uncensored text of what Rav Kook wrote, plus many footnotes, brief and illuminating footnotes that Moreno Harav Moshe Tzuriel Zitzal added to the text. Very helpful remarks and footnotes, nothing very long but brief. And at the end of each section of each paragraph or each chapter, there is a line or two which sums up the gist of what was said in that section. So in many ways, this is the best and the most accessible and most user-friendly version of this text of Rav Kook. These 8 notebooks, these Shmona Kivatzim, were handed to the Nazir, and Rav Kook said to him, "You have my permission to organize the material and edit as you see fit." Although he also expressed his opinion on more than one occasion. Moreno Rav Gadol Ma'orenaim, Rav Avraham Yitzchak HaKohen Kook Zitzal, he said on a number of occasions, as is testified by several people who knew him personally, that in his view nothing needed to be changed. But he did understand that perhaps the material could be organized according to subject matter or something along those lines. And that's what the Nazir did in the books called Orot HaKodesh. Orot HaKodesh is all material from the Shmona Kivatzim, organized according to topic and theme. And sometimes I sit down and I compare the original version that we have, such as this edition of Rav Tzuriel, and the other edition that was printed about 30 years ago based on the original manuscripts, and what we have in Orot HaKodesh. And the differences are usually very, very minor. Normally there's no difference, and occasionally there are minor differences. Very occasionally there is a difference. It's often not an attempt to hide something or change something, but simply apparently a misreading of the manuscript, or a word was difficult to decipher, or was a printing error. I have the original edition of Orot HaKodesh, and there are a number of printing errors there which were later corrected in later editions. What I can tell you is that Moreno Harav Moshe Tzuriel Zitzal was of the view that Rav Kook is best learnt exactly as it was written, without any organization, without any editing, without any change, whatever, just to be read as Rav Kook wrote these things. And I must state that this is also my feeling. When one reads the original text as it was written in the order it was written, even though it's not always there's not always a connection between one section and the next. In fact, usually there isn't. Sometimes there is. That is also illuminating in its own way. Moreno Rav Tzuriel Zitzal published many books. He had a tremendous bikiyuth and a tremendous memory, and this was really his strength. Bring together various sources and juxtaposing them and quoting from all manner of books, many of which most people don't come across, and writing likutim, in other words, précises of information of many great Chachmei Torah that appear in all manner of books, in all styles of books. Rav Tzuriel was baki in Kabbalah, in all kinds of Sifrei Musar. He was also baki clearly, obviously, in the Talmud, and he knew Kidvei Rav Kook almost by heart, one could say, and remembered each source and remembered the page. And I have many notes that I wrote on the side of the pages of my books, things that Rav Zuriel said to me as we were learning, where he quoted from memory, this appears over there or over somewhere else. It says something different or similar, depending on what was being discussed. At the beginning of this book, because when it has to be explained that when Rav Tzuriel wished to publish certain writings of Rav Kook that had been censored or had been hidden deliberately from the public, he was attacked, and he knew he would be attacked for so doing, which is why he wished to receive permission from those who, one would imagine, have the legal and moral right to express an opinion on the subject, whether he, Rav Tzuriel, could publish these works. So you will see the beginning of this volume on page 8, and with it there is a letter, which you can see a copy of it here. It's printed in the old days on one of those old style printers, as you might be able to see. This letter, I was actually instrumental in putting this letter together. Together with Rav Zuriel, I wrote the actual wording of that letter, in which it says that I, the undersigned, know Rav Zuriel and rely on him and trust him to publish these works of Rav Kook in the most responsible and most efficacious way, and I give my permission. The person who wrote this and signed this letter was someone that I knew, Harav Shlomo Eliyahu Ra'anan Zetzal, Hashem Yikom Damo. He was the grandson of Rabbeinu Rav Kook Zetzal. The son-in-law of Rav Kook was Harav Ra'anan. His son was Harav Shlomo Eliyahu Ra'anan, and I knew this grandson when I was studying in Mekaz Rav, and I even had a fairly good relationship with him, which is why Rav Tzuriel asked me to speak to him, to Rav Ra'anan, and ask him whether he would be willing to sign such a letter, giving him permission as the grandson, as the Yoresh, the inheritor of the physical manuscripts of Rav Kook, of which there are literally apparently something like 200,000 pages, and I'm not exaggerating. This is the figure that was stated by Gaon Rav Avram Shapira Zetzal, Rosh Hashiva of Mekaz Rav. This is quoted by Rav Tzuriel also in one of his books, that figure. So those who inherited Al-Pidin, according to the law of the Torah, and perhaps according to other systems of law as well, the writings of Rav Kook, you would think would be the family first and foremost. And therefore he asked for their permission, which Rav Ra'anan was happy to give. And the actual signing of this letter, which appears, as I just showed you, in this and other books that Rav Tzuriel published of Rav Kook's writings, that letter was actually signed in my Bet Midrash in Rehov Najara, together with Rav Tzuriel. So the three of us were there, Rav Ra'anan, myself, and Rav Tzuriel, and was signed there. And he made sure to print at the beginning of each of these books so that certain other people who had some axe to grind against Rav Tzuriel, because he, Rav Tzuriel, was in favor of publishing Rav Kook's works rather than hiding them. And there were those who wished to hide them or to edit them and censor them, and therefore they would have preferred that he not be given such permission. But such permission was given, and thus he was able to overcome all these various obstacles. So I was Baruch Hashem zoche to have play some small part in Rav Tzuriel receiving that Ktav Haskama, that letter of approbation and agreement that he work on Rav Kook's writings and publish them. Rav Tzuriel did not just publish writings that had already been published. He found many manuscripts and articles and things that had been printed in Rav Kook's time that had been forgotten, and he found them and printed them in many volumes that he put together. There's a set of about 7 volumes called Otzrot HaRa'aya. I'll show you one volume. This is one of 7-volume set, full of Rav Kook's writings or indices and other helpful material on Rav Kook's writings that Rav Tzuriel was able to put together. So in all, we're talking about thousands of pages of material. I will also mention that Rav Zuriel was not one of those people not one of those Rabbanim who feel that certain things should be viewed and defined as politics and that one should not express an opinion. This, of course, is untrue. The Torah covers all aspects of life and existence. The Torah has what to say on everything, particularly with anything at all to do with the welfare, the safety, the flourishing of the Jewish people. So Rav Tzuriel Zitzal was outspoken about many of these things. Nor did he think that one should not criticize Israeli governments and officials where such criticism is due and is necessary. He was not mamlachti, as the expression goes, at all. And I'll give you, in conclusion, I will tell you another anecdote, something which is not known, I think, by many people. Harav Shlomo Eliyahu Ra'anan, who signed that letter, the grandson of Rav Kook, he lived in Yerushalayim, in Kiryat Moshe, most of his life, on Rehov Reines. I know where he lived. I was in his home at least on 1 or 2 occasions. And but he moved away from Yerushalayim. He lived in the original Yishuv of Beitar, which became the city of Beitar today, eventually. And later he moved to Hebron. Mishpahat Ra'anan lived in a certain house which overlooked a certain street. And the Israeli army had an observation post on a nearby building that was occupied. Whether it belonged to them is another question, but it was occupied by Arabs, by our enemies. But because this was a good vantage point, the army placed a couple of soldiers there on the rooftop of that building, because it overlooked a couple of the streets around that area where there were also several houses inhabited by Jews. One of those families was Rav Ra'anan's family. It came to pass that the Arab family who lived in this particular house, on the roof of which there was this lookout point, this this observation post, they complained to the authorities. They complained. Of course, they were funded by and aided by all our wonderful friends in Europe, like the Germans and the Swedes and the British, and many good Israelis as well, of course. And they were aided and abetted, and they got legal assistance, and they took it to the High Court, to the so-called High Court of Justice, the Bagats, Bet Din Gavoa L'Tzedek, so they call themselves. And you will see exactly in a moment exactly what kind of tzedek, what kind of justice, and what righteousness they mete out. So this family complained that they did not want these soldiers on the roof of their house. Now, you would think that someone who is not an Israeli citizen would not be able to petition an Israeli court. But of course, the Bagats, the so-called High Court of Justice, decided many years ago, I'm not sure if this was a decision by the Rasha, Aaron Barak, or somebody else, they decided many years ago that they will receive all petitions by all Arabs on all matters from Yudan Shomron, and therefore this petition was heard by this High Court of Justice. And surprise, surprise, it was decided by the court that yes, the army must remove these soldiers from that rooftop because these Arabs were complaining. Now, it just so happened that the soldiers on that rooftop were able, as I mentioned, to observe constantly certain areas and points in that neighborhood. And one of those points was a point directly below the first floor window of the house in which the Ra'anan family lived, in which Rav Ra'anan lived. So they were able to observe that house and the window and the street below it. But when the court decided that these soldiers must be removed from their observation post on that roof, there was no longer anybody who could observe those points and those areas. And it came to pass, therefore, no surprise here, no one should be surprised, that this was immediately noted by our enemies. And on a certain day, it happened, I don't remember the year, it was many years ago, something like 30 years ago, I imagine, that some young member of the Arab populace of Hebron, one of our enemies, was able to climb in through that window into the house of Rav Ra'anan and attacked Rav Ra'anan with a knife and killed him. And thus the life of the grandson, the neched of Moreno Hagadol, Rav Kook Zitzal, was killed in Hebron, in his own home, by an Arab who was able to climb through the window of that house, because the soldiers who had been guarding that area and observing that area were no longer able to do so. This was a direct result of the decision of the High Court of Justice, for which, of course, they've never had to give any account. They've never been held to account. Because, as usual, and I mention these things in connection with Rav Tzuriel because Rav Tzuriel would speak about these things to me frequently, both in our face-to-face meetings and in our telephone conversations. And he would complain bitterly about the evil people who man these positions and who make such decisions and bring such disaster upon the Jewish people. Rav Tzuriel did not think this was politics, and of course it is not politics. It is Torah, pure and simple. But their version, the version of the Erev Rav, the Rishaim, and Rav Tzuriel was most definitely in favor of calling some of these people by the term Erev Rav, which is again something that others did not like, and therefore they complained bitterly about things that he said sometimes, such as using that term. But Rav Tzuriel was adamant that there are such people amongst us, something which, for instance, in the Zohar, which many of these same people who complain about these things, who did not like what Rav Tzuriel was saying, they are great believers in the Sefer Zohar. The Zohar is full of references to such people within the Jewish people in these generations who are from the Erev Rav and who will cause tremendous damage and harm and bring nothing but disaster upon the Jewish people. And this is such an example. We see how these people who were criticized constantly by Rav Zuriel Zitzal bring tragedy and disaster and bloodshed upon us. And this is a fitting topic for discussion when eulogizing Mori Gadol Arav Moshe Yehiel Tzuriel Zitzal. May his works, the many books that he printed, and his teachings, and his many shiurim, which you can also see on YouTube, by the way, in Hebrew. May his teachings, his works, his Torah open our eyes and direct us towards a deeper and more profound understanding of Torah and how to be Ovdei Hashem Be'emeth, how to come close to Hashem. This was his aim. This was his the main purpose of all his writings, to bring people closer to Hashem. Yehi Zichro Livracha.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.